Welcome to today's lecture on high-intensity interval training. High-intensity interval training, or most often abbreviated as HIIT, has, I would say, developed as a very, very important training method, probably within the last 20 years, but I'd say we see a quite dramatic increase in scientific publications within the last 10 years. High-intensity interval training also has been within the top 5 or top 10 of the fitness trends, which are annually published by the American College of Sports Medicine. And as I recall, within the last maybe 5 to 10 years, high-intensity interval training almost every time was among the top 10. And of course, high-intensity interval training is very popular on social media, and with the hashtag HIIT, you'll find quite different areas and quite different information about this special training method. Please be aware, sometimes when we talk, we abbreviate HIIT as HIIT training, but we know there are quite different HIIT protocols, and the two probably most different ones are HIIT, which is more related to endurance or endurance exercise, in HIIT, which is a special training method to further promote especially protein synthesis or hypertrophy within maybe probably the bodybuilding or strength training community. So if we talk about HIIT, we should be aware of which type of HIIT we're talking. Is it more related to endurance, or is it more related to strength training? So within the literature or within the practical area, if you do endurance type of exercise, either on a bicycle ergometer or on a treadmill, if you do so-called incremental tests, which is a stepwise increase of exercise intensity over time, you will find 3, sometimes maybe 5 different intensity zones, which you can feel, but also you can measure. For example, on a very low exercise intensity task, which is maybe moderate intensity running or low intensity running, you will perceive this type of running as moderate, which is in the area about below or at 60-65% of peak heart rate. Then from the transition from moderate to heavy exercise intensity, you will define, or you will feel that type of exercise as quite heavy. And from the transition from heavy to severe, which is at about 85 plus minus % of peak heart rate, you will transit into the severe exercise domain. And depending on the federation, depending on the sport, you might even have 5 different zones or even 7 or 8 different zones. But for simplicity, today I will talk for the 3 zone model, because also in practical terms, I find it quite hard to distinguish if you have a 5 zone model or a 7 zone model. It's quite difficult to precisely define what is zone 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. So today we'll keep it simple, and we'll stick to these to the zone with the boundaries usually between the first rise in lactate or the first rise in ventilatory measures, to what we call MLSS, maximal lactate steady state, which is approximately at 4-ish millimole of blood lactate. Yeah. So if we take these zones on this scale here, the green zone 1, yellow zone 2, and red zone 3, basically one important, let's say, intensity exercise is probably an intensity you would be able to run for maybe 8 to, let's say, maybe 15 minutes, which is probably very, very close to your maximum oxygen uptake. So that's a task you most probably will be able to run for maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe even 20 minutes, depending on how fit you are. But in order to achieve higher velocity or higher power output, or generally to produce more energy over time, you usually execute high intensity exercise not as a continuous form of training. You'll apply this type of exercise as a high intensity interval training session. And the high intensity interval session usually is at a higher velocity compared to the velocity you would be able to run for, let's say, one time. So you can run at a higher intensity, which is above VO2 max, higher at the velocity at VO2 max. But of course, you need to recover. And after a certain time of recovery, which can be maybe 30 seconds, 60 seconds, depending on a protocol, you can repeat this type of very high intensity exercise. So this is what we would call high intensity exercise here in this area. Now, if you shorten the interval bout, you will be able to go even at a higher exercise intensity, which is maybe the case in this area here. Of course, after a while, you'll probably need a little bit longer recovery periods, but adding up over time, the time you can spend at a higher intensity, especially compared to maybe this intensity here, is definitely quite higher. And that's one goal of the high intensity interval training, just to have a higher intensity and basically a longer period at a higher intensity over time. And then after a while, you're quite close to your sprint performance. Maybe not 100%, but maybe at 95, 96% of your sprint ability. And if you repeat the sprints, of course, with a certain type of recovery time in between, you can sprint quite often before you find a decrease in your sprint performance over time. And if you really do sprints, all-out sprints, of course, you will need a little bit longer recovery period as well. And this form of exercise then is probably not determined or not defined as high-intensity interval training. It would be termed as sprint interval training. If you repeat the sprints more often and maybe in sets, that's what we would call sprint, repeated sprints. And all these, let's say, all this family, that's what I would call high-intensity interval training, which is within the domain, the high-intensity exercise domain, or the severe exercise intensity domain. I will show you a short video, and you can see on the right side, let's say, the families from the very right side, the sprint interval training, to the more here in the middle, and to the more typical interval training you would find in endurance training. And this is surely one form of sprint interval training on the left side. So this is an example of a, let's say, maybe 30-second full out sprint. Or you can do a similar type of exercise, maybe not linear sprinting, but maybe multi-directional sprinting, as it is the case here. So this could be maybe 10 seconds on, 10 to 15 seconds off. It depends a little bit on the protocol, so it doesn't necessarily need to be on a linear scale. So this could be multi-directional. And just by having this type of model, you will be, as a coach, or if you advise athletes, you then can plan certain type of endurance related exercises. And for example, from this model here, you could use a quite strong emphasis in zone 1, which is probably this type of exercise. This is if you spend a lot of time in zone 1, this is what we will call basic endurance exercise. More time in a session in zone 3, that's probably, I would say, accomplished by high intensity interval training, which then is also termed high intensity interval training. A combination of zone 1 and zone 3. They're quite different combinations, but this typical combination is called polarized. Polarized meaning a lot of time spent in zone 1, less in zone 2, and the least time spent in zone 2. Threshold training is, I don't want to say the opposite, but quite different to the polarized model, with a quite strong emphasis on threshold training. And now from this type of model, of course, you could probably define hundreds of different training sessions or training protocols. Which one is the better one or not? That's a question we will try to answer in the following slides as well. So before we talk about maybe a long-term perspective, I'd like to show you other forms which are also termed high-intensity interval training, which can be related more to strength training. If you look into this publication here, you'll find 4 different types of exercises which these participants in the studies who performed, let's say, a combination of strength training with, related more or less to higher or high intensity cardiorespiratory effort interspersed with, let's say, some minutes and some time of recovery in between. I hope this video works. I will show you a video here of a very small or short high intensity session you can perform at home. This is a study we actually performed at the workplace for desk workers as a recovery break in between. So in this study, for example, this person here or others, they sat for 1 hour. They performed this 6-minute high-intensity interval session. The video can be seen here as well in this publication for 6 minutes. And then they had to sit for another 2 hours. And we compared both situations, sitting for complete 3 hours versus having just a 6-minute high intensity interval training break. between. And just from the data here, if you just compare the amount of energy turnover during the 6 minute or just adding the 6 minute high intensity interval training compared to 3 hours of pure sitting, then you find about 100 calories more on energy expenditure just due to this 6 minute high intensity interval training. So showing that it is a quite strong and quite potential stimulus just to improve your energy expenditure over time. Also, within this 6 minute high intensity session here, you find quite enormous blood lactate values, quite high, around 7 to 8 millimole of blood lactate. And over time, the interesting part here is you will find a decrease in your respiratory exchange ratio. So a little bit of downshift here. And this downshift basically means you have a higher oxidation of fatty acids. So you have a quite high acidosis with your cardiorespiratory levels close to 90% of peak heart rate. And the interesting part is it takes about 90 minutes to return back to baseline. You, as I said, or as I mentioned, you also find a higher fat metabolism after time, but interestingly, not with increased feeling of hunger. So it's a quite interesting model, these high intensity, we call them snacks or recovery breaks in between. Also, a combination of strength and endurance training. We also looked into that type of exercise and from a 9-week functional strength and endurance training, so a combination of high intensity endurance workouts and high intensity interval strength workouts, you find a quite enormous decrease in body weight, not a very high increase, but quite interesting. It's a quite interesting model here, and in this publication here you also will find the exact precise, let's say, training protocol applied here. Interestingly, we also applied high intensity interval training within the school, in a school setting. And every time we combine strength and endurance training in children, usually we do not find improvements on the endurance side, but usually we always find improvements on the strength side. So this type of exercise could be actually quite interesting to improve more strength-related variables, but not so much endurance-related variables. So what are the main effects of high intensity interval training? So if we look at in this slide here on data we collected over the last almost 10 years with very similar testing protocols, with very similar testing devices, with let's say intervention lasting from 3 to 9 weeks with 2 to 5 units or sessions per week. What we find is on average an improvement in your VO2 max of about 1%. That's actually quite equal to what we find in meta-analysis. If we just apply zone 1 exercise, you will find an increase on average of about 0.7%. And if you combine both exercises, high intensity interval training and basic endurance training, as a mixed model, you're roughly at about 0.99%. Interestingly, the red dots is the baseline fitness level of each participant in the study. So there were quite, let's say, Olympic champions involved here, but also, let's say, cardiac patients or very unfit person. The type of exercise really doesn't matter that much. if you perform basic endurance training or high intensity interval training, it's not that the persons with a high fitness need, for example, high intensity interval training, or the other way around. The lower fit people would maybe enjoy more or have higher benefits from basic endurance training. That's actually not the case. So it seems quite independent of your fitness level. And overall, about 1% per week change. That's usually the 5 to 7% increase in VO2 max you will find on a typical training intervention study over time. So actually this data here from our lab quite nicely fits into the existing data we find. Here, this is an older meta-analysis. I think it needs some update because there's more data coming out, or there's more data which has come out, and they find a difference, or they found a difference in about 1 milliliter per minute per kilogram body weight if you match high intensity interval training to moderate continuous exercise. So yeah, that's about the increase you will have. So now the question is, why is high intensity interval training so interesting? Well, I would say this was the study showing the first very important differences between low intensity exercise and high intensity exercise. And in this study, which was performed with soccer players, the soccer players performed or had an 8-week intervention, manipulating 3 training sessions per week. So one group exercised in zone 1, which is about 65 to 70% of peak heart rate for 45 minutes. One group in zone 2 with a little higher exercise intensity for 25 minutes. One group performed 15 seconds all-out exercise and 15 seconds recovery. Repeated this type of session for 47 times. So 47 times 15 seconds all-out, 15 seconds recovery, which is approximately 90% of peak heart rate. And another group performed 4 minutes of intervals with 3 minutes recovery, which is close to 90% of peak heart rate. And the interesting part is in those training sessions or training methods applying zone 3, those are the ones we find the highest increase in VO2 max. So the question is, why is VO2 max, why does it increase? And one important variable for an increase in VO2 max is an increase in stroke volume. So the amount of blood which is pumped into the system per heartbeat increases quite dramatically, or I would even say only by zone 3 exercise. And the minute you pump more blood into the bloodstream, the minute you have more oxygen within your system, more oxygen at the muscle cell level. And that's most probably the most prominent mechanism or important mechanism or when applying high intensity interval training. There are other more cellular adaptation at the muscle cell level. And one interesting aspect on a cellular level is if you have a high energy flow by high intensity interval training, or you have repeated muscle contractions over time, the different pathways of both sides of the high intensity interval side, the continuous or moderate continuous intensity exercise, both stimulate PGC1 alpha, which is an important, let's say, master switch in creating or in building up mitochondria or mitochondria efficiency over time. So actually on the peripheral, on the muscular level, both types of exercise, either zone 1 or zone 3, seem to have quite similar end adaptation over time. But if you want to improve stroke volume, that's quite sure only possible from the data available through zone 3 or in high intensity interval training. So, and just to summarize, or maybe to give you a brief summary on why this is so important, is just because the oxygen uptake is is highly dependent on the stroke volume. So this type of exercise here, this is the one that improves stroke volume, and mitochondrial biogenesis, or in the end it's oxygen extraction and forming of ATP through oxygen extraction. This can be managed by either zone 1 or zone 3 exercise. So I'd like to give you a shift on or shift in perspective on high intensity interval training in youth competitive sports, just because I've been interested in youth competitive sports for quite a while now, and I'll show you two quite interesting studies which show how you will be able, or how someone could apply high intensity interval training within the youth population. So if you look at children just on in school, for example, when they have a school break, 15-minute school break, this is a boy and a girl. I measured heart rate. I gave them a heart rate monitor, and as you can see, heart rate goes up and down, up and down, up and down, close to 200 in the peaks, and on the lower level maybe around 120, 130 beats per minute in the heart rate. So actually, children's normal or natural behavior is quite polar. It's quite up. It goes up, high intensity recovery, high intensity recovery, and it's not so much a continuous exercise over time. So I wanted to know in two studies, I wanted to know the effects on this up and down on interval training, first in swimmers and then in soccer players. These are the two studies we conducted also about 10 years ago, and I just wanted to show you the basic idea behind the study. So the basic idea behind the study was a little bit to replicate the study I showed you before. So applying something like a 4x4 minute interval training, and compare the 4x4 minute interval training to a high volume exercise training session over time. So these were the two groups, the group in swimming, age 11 plus minus, and as you can see, a typical normal distributed, I would say, children's group, from the slower growing children to the already accelerated boys here on this side. That's a quite normal study. The interesting part about this study was it's a crossover design, meaning that half of the group first started with high intensity interval training, and after the summer break, they then performed high volume exercise training, and on the other side, the first half or the second half performing high volume training before the summer break performed high intensity interval training after the summer break. So we had quite different variables. We measured blood lactate values, RPE, perception or rating of perceived exertion, 2000 meter times 100 meter time, maximum lactate accumulation, VO2 max, and different other values as well. And Before I show you the results, I'll show you a little bit the basic training idea. So high intensity interval training was performed for 60 minutes overall, and high volume training for 90 minutes. And each training session more or less had the same architecture. After warm up, there was a 50-minute all-out sprint with some technical drills, and then the children started high intensity interval training, the other group high volume training over time. And here's just for one side. So for one high intensity interval training was about 30 kilometers overall training, and in high volume it's basically double the volume of the high intensity interval training. So in the end, as you can see, two completely different training protocols in terms of intensity and volume. Now to the results here. If you look at the 2,000 meter times, you will find a decrease in time, which is good. It's children become better. This is roughly around 21 seconds in the high intensity interval group, and for high volume it's about 13 seconds. 100 meter times improves by roughly 3 seconds. There's a higher blood lactate production rate within high intensity interval training, but not high volume. VO2 max increases in both groups, a little bit more in the high intensity interval group. And the LEN points, which are points related to their swim performance, also quite dramatically increase in connection with the high intensity interval training, not so much with high volume training. So this is the actual real competition performance on both sides. So it's a quite interesting training model, because having almost half of the volume, but having an improved or increased competition performance actually was, at least from my side or my idea, how I saw the kids, is quite motivating, and I think it should be applied within children's conditioning. So from that study, we then went on to soccer. Soccer, a little bit older, in this case boys, older boys. Also two groups, one performing high intensity interval training, the other one high volume training. Here you can see the different protocols, high intensity protocols. High volume exercise was usually performed as a continuous endurance exercise over time. So this basically is this here, and this one on this side here. And before and after the 5 weeks of intervention, we also performed different performance measures. As you can see here, with high intensity interval training, you find the typical 7%, 5 to 7% increase. High volume, no increase. You find a decrease in the 1,000 meter time of about 4%, which is close to about 10 seconds for 1,000 meters, which is quite enormous in 14-year-old boys, and that's only within 5 weeks. That's quite good. Just as a rough estimate, you can say 4 milliliters increase in VO2 max is about 10% decrease in 10,000 meter time. So if a child improves by 10%, by 10 seconds in the 1,000 meter running time, approximately you will have about 5% increase, 5 milliliter increase in VO2 max. There were no differences, or we couldn't find any differences in jump height nor in sprint performance. We don't really know why. Probably because within the warm-up, both groups performed sprints, warm-up sprints, and also jumping tasks. So maybe that's the reason why we didn't see any major major differences here. In the end, from both studies, if you ask, when we asked the children which type of exercise do you prefer, it was quite, I would say, evenly distributed. About 50% preferred the high intensity interval training, and the other 50% the high volume exercise training. So I think depends a little bit also on how the protocols were made and how often and how many sessions were performed. But in the end, it shows that it seems that some of the children really enjoy the type of exercise. So one, I think there are several aspects we need to mention when performing high intensity interval training, and there are some pros definitely for high intensity interval training, but there are also some drawbacks, which I would like to highlight a little bit more in detail. So just from a psychological point of view, when training effort and the training effect seem to be in a favorable relationship, then this type of exercise actually is enjoyed a little bit or perceived as more motivating than the other way around. So as I mentioned before, high intensity interval training, the effects can be accomplished in dramatically less time compared to high volume exercise. So there seems to be a motivational factor just dependent on the time, the time you invest into training. But there are also some drawbacks, and the most important ones, I would say, if you perform especially sprint interval training, many of the students are dizzy or become dizzy, or the participants, not the students, but the participants become dizzy. Sometimes they feel, they don't feel really good or well. There might be some vomiting involved, actually quite often. And also prolonged sweating, especially after the interval sessions, which can last up to maybe half an hour or hour, depending on the ambient conditions you're in. So these 4 points actually are sometimes, maybe I would say, the reason why high intensity interval training is not applied quite often. Also, there are other, let's say, potential, I don't want to say risks, but some information I think you need to know when applying high intensity interval training. High intensity interval training usually is quite complex. You need to have a certain knowledge on what you do. You need to define the interval intensity, the interval duration, recovery time, and this complexity after a while also requires a certain level of motivation and confidence. And together, the complexity, a high level of motivation and confidence together most probably is a certain barrier to perform high intensity interval training over time. So maybe one good strategy is not to frequently apply high intensity interval training, but maybe on a regular basis, and not so much as a key component to your exercise. But of course, that depends on the population we're talking about. And then, of course, there are some clear health-related contraindications related to high-intensity interval training. I would say you can see all the, let's say, health issues which more or less prohibit high intensity interval training. And yeah, the most important one I would say is every time a situation is unclear, or you have an unclear, let's say, health situation, then of course high intensity interval training might not be the best protocol to apply. We had some concern when we started with high intensity interval training regarding immune function. We applied high intensity interval training, and we measured certain variables very important for immune health. And in our studies, we couldn't find differences between high intensity interval training and moderate continuous exercise, but others have. So I would say this situation is still a little bit unclear. Of course, it depends on how often you apply high intensity interval training, with whom you apply high intensity interval training, and when. So I would say we cannot really solve or answer the question, is high intensity interval detrimental or a benefit to your immune health? But I would say, of course, it can become an issue, but not necessarily if you perform high intensity interval training maybe once or twice a week. Then I want to raise your awareness maybe on one issue we have within scientific literature. And usually when we compare high intensity interval training, we measure the amount of energy expenditure performed during high intensity interval training, and then we tell the subjects to perform the exact same amount of energy expenditure but at a low intensity continuous exercise. So usually in scientific studies, both different training protocols are matched by intensity, so-called isocaloric matching. But to be honest, I think in real life situation, usually, especially endurance athletes, runners, cyclists, and so on, when they perform low intensity continuous exercise, it's actually quite long. It's maybe even 2 hours, 3 hours, depending on the sport. And so far, I haven't really read clear differences between high intensity interval training and a very low intensity, but a very long duration exercise, which most probably is, I would say, more performed in the real life or real training life. So sometimes the low intensity exercise is maybe not as effective as high intensity interval training, but that's most probably because of the isocaloric comparisons. And I personally believe if you do the exercise intensities longer, then I would say most probably the low intensity exercise maybe even has a higher effect, but of course it takes more time compared to high intensity interval training. So how can you transfer the knowledge we've gained so far into practice? I think from my experience, a very valuable tool is just a simple step test. Anybody can do the step test either on a track, on a treadmill, on a bicycle ergometer. It doesn't matter. And for example, if you perform this protocol here, and at your very, very last stage, which can be maybe 16 kilometers per hour or 14, depending on your fitness level, the last step you can perform for 3 minutes is actually a quite good start for your first high intensity interval training session. So your first high intensity interval session, you will then start maybe for 4 minutes with this intensity exercise or intensity you perform during a step test. And then you perform 4 of these intervals, and usually you should be fine. Within the second high intensity interval session, you then will increase the exercise intensity just a little bit, maybe in the third or in the fourth interval. So you have a slightly higher overall intensity compared to your first training session. And in the third training session, you then improve or you enhance or you step up the intensity just a little bit on all four intervals. And then over time, you will have an increase in exercise intensity over time. And usually after about 10 sessions, that's when you have a certain level of adaptation. And that's when I would recommend going back to a clear zone one exercise, maybe for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then go back into the high intensity interval training session. And you should be fine. You should be fine then. So actually, this is more or less a summary, almost. Is there good reasoning when maybe to start with high intensity interval training? And I believe just from a psychological point, I think there is. Sprint interval training and high intensity interval training for many populations, even for youth or even for some other athletes, it's usually complex. It's sometimes unknown, and of course it's perceived as difficult and as strenuous sometimes. So that's one end of the spectrum, and then you have training sessions which are simple, they're known, they're easy to accomplish on the other side. For example, if you're a patient in a hospital and you want to regain fitness, you most probably will start with interval training. Of course, not with high intensity interval training. You will start with low intensity interval training, maybe just from, let's say, 1 minute walking, 1 minute sitting or resting, 1 minute walking, cycling, and so on. And if you're stable on doing that, then of course you can go for a hike, you can walk, you do continuous maybe cycling for a certain time. And then, after maybe some time, you will be able to exercise maybe for 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hour. And if you're stable on that level, you can start with a little bit higher intensity intervals, which you're usually not used to. For example, it could be 1 minute at maybe 50 or maybe even higher, maybe 60 to 70% of peak heart rate. And then maybe you increase the numbers of intervals over time. And when you're stable on this level, then of course you can run a little bit at a higher intensity, maybe for 20, 40 minutes. And if you're stable on that level, then you can think about applying high intensity interval training. And unfortunately, in many studies, patients start on this level. And if you start on this level, I would say maybe over time it can become unmotivating, frustrating, maybe less enjoyable. So I would say starting on the levels you come from, you then improve your intensity or improve the level you have over time. And I think the spectrum is quite good. So to summarize this lecture today is high intensity interval training definitely is not high intensity interval training. The interval training sessions or protocols vary in intensity, in volume, in recovery, of course, and in the frequency over time. So if we talk about high intensity interval training, we always need to re-ask or just reassure which type of high intensity interval training we're talking about. It seems that high intensity interval is very popular, but the question is it effective for everybody? Is it effective for the population I'm trying to improve certain dimensions? Is it liked? Do people like it? And is it tolerated? So those are, I think, quite important questions, because if it's not liked and if it's not tolerated, then of course it doesn't make sense to apply high intensity training for a longer period of time. Within a scientific, let's say, short training experiment, of course, you might be able to blunt these aspects, but not in a real life situation. So that's something I think it's very important to think about. Yeah, and most probably in the end, there are many ways on applying high intensity interval training. There are many paths, and personally, I think in the elite area, in the elite sessions, we know we need a high amount of exercise in zone 1, and of course zone 3 exercise is important, but maybe not always as much as we think about, and definitely not in the health area. In the health area, high intensity interval training might be an option, but it is not the option. Yes, so if you have any other questions, don't hesitate and contact me or ask me questions, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.